We don't have time for history lessons from washed-up farmers who can't keep their own land. This property belongs to whoever can write the biggest check, Gregory Bennett announced, his voice echoing through Summit Auction House as 72-year-old. Frank Miller stood frozen in place, clutching a worn leather portfolio. The old farmer's weathered face flushed with humiliation as Bennett signaled security to escort him out. But 20 minutes later, when 3 black military Humvees rolled into the auction house parking lot with government plates and armed escorts, Bennett's smug expression dissolved into shock as the decorated officer who emerged introduced himself with quiet authority. "I'm Colonel William Miller, Department of Defense Historical Preservation Division. Frank Miller is my father, and we need to discuss how you're attempting to sell property containing classified military artifacts before the federal government can complete its assessment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Summit Auction House dominated the renovated flour mill at the edge of Redwood Valley, its pristine modern interior contrasting sharply with the weathered red brick exterior. What had once been the economic heart of Westridge County's agricultural community now served as the clearinghouse, where family farms became development opportunities. The vast open space of the former mill floor gleamed with polished concrete, digital displays, and rows of plush seating where investors stared at tablets instead of the land they were bidding on. Gregory Bennett had transformed Summit Auctions from a modest local business into a regional powerhouse over the last decade. At 55, he carried himself with the calculated confidence of someone who had never worked the land but had become wealthy selling it. His tailored suits and imported shoes set him apart from the farming community he had targeted as his business opportunity. Originally from Chicago's competitive real estate market, Bennett had discovered that rural land auctions offered fewer regulations and more trusting sellers, a perfect combination for someone with his ambitions. "Oak Ridge Farm represents a prime investment opportunity," Bennett announced from his elevated platform, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who had mastered appearing trustworthy while revealing only selective truths. 450 acres of developable land with excellent road frontage and no conservation easements. The Zoning Commission has already indicated preliminary approval for subdivision into residential parcels. The assembled bidders, mostly representatives from development companies and investment firms, nodded appreciatively as Bennett highlighted the property's water rights, timber value, and proximity to the expanding suburban boundaries of Madison Heights, the nearest city. Digital screens flanking the auctioneer displayed drone footage of the rolling farmland, computer-generated images of potential housing developments, and spreadsheets projecting return on investment figures. "We'll start the bidding at $8 million, Bennett continued, scanning the room with practiced precision. "Remember, ladies and gentlemen, this represents less than $8,500 per acre for land that could yield returns of over 400% when developed." The auction house doors opened quietly, and Frank Miller entered, moving with the deliberate pace of someone whose joints reminded him daily of decades spent working in all weather conditions. His faded blue chambray shirt and well-worn denim stood in stark contrast to the business attire surrounding him. Frank carried a leather portfolio stuffed with documents, some clearly recent printouts and others yellowed with age. He took a seat in the back row, his presence immediately noted by several attendees who recognized the former owner of one of the county's most productive dairy operations. Before medical bills from his wife Margaret's long battle with cancer had forced him to sell most of his land, Frank Miller had been a respected figure in Westridge County's agricultural community. Now he maintained a modest organic vegetable operation on his remaining 12 acres, selling at the local farmers market and to a few restaurants in Madison Heights. Bennett noticed the newcomer immediately, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face before he continued his polished sales pitch. The southern portion features exceptional soil quality, while the northern section offers beautiful woodland, perfect for luxury home sites with natural privacy. As the bidding began, representatives raised their paddles in quick succession, pushing the price upward in $100,000 increments. Bennett orchestrated the process with practiced efficiency, building excitement as figures climbed well beyond what any local farmer could hope to match. During a brief pause between bids, Frank raised his hand. "Excuse me," he called, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had once served as president of the county agricultural board. "There's important information about Oak Ridge Farm that should be disclosed before this proceeds further." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Bennett's professional smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sir, if you're not registered to bid, I must ask you to refrain from interrupting the proceedings." "I'm not trying to disrupt," Frank replied, with calm dignity. "But there's a significant historical assessment pending for the northern section of this property. The Department of Defense Historical Preservation Division submitted an application 4 months ago." Bennett's irritation became visible. "Sir, all legal aspects of this property have been thoroughly vetted by our legal team. Unless you are prepared to participate with a minimum bid of $8 million, I must ask you to remain silent." Frank opened his portfolio, removing a document. The historical assessment concerns a series of underground structures dating back to 1942. The property served as a classified communications outpost during World War II. The Preservation Division's preliminary findings indicate the bunkers remain structurally intact and contain historical artifacts. Bennett stepped away from his podium, approaching Frank directly. "Mr. Miller, Frank Miller, correct?" "Mr. Miller, this is a private auction for qualified investors. We're not here to debate potential designations that may or may not be approved." "I served on the County Historical Preservation Board for 22 years, Frank explained, his voice steady despite Bennett's dismissive tone. "The Department of Defense. Assessment is scheduled for completion next month. Any buyer should know that development plans for that section would likely be restricted." "What might be restricted," Bennett interrupted coldly, "is speculative at best. These parcels will be sold today according to current legal status, not pending applications or possibilities." Frank removed another document from his portfolio. "I have a copy of the preliminary assessment here, signed by the Department of Defense Historical Preservation Division last week. The military significance is well documented." "Security," Bennett called over his shoulder. "Please escort this gentleman out. He's disrupting a private business event." 2 men in dark suits approached as shocked whispers spread through the room. "I'm simply providing relevant information about the property," Frank said, his voice steady despite the humiliation. "Potential buyers deserve to know about restrictions that will affect their investment." Bennett's voice took on a dismissive tone, intended to be heard by the wealthy clients surrounding them. "Mr. Miller, I understand that watching these old properties change hands must be difficult for certain residents clinging to the past. But this is the reality of market economics. We don't have time for history lessons from washed-up farmers who can't keep their own land. This property belongs to whoever can write the biggest check." A pained expression flickered across Frank's face at the public humiliation, but he carefully returned the documents to his portfolio and stood with dignity. "My family farmed in this valley for 4 generations, Mr. Bennett. We understood something you've forgotten, that land carries history that deserves respect. Some places hold secrets and significance beyond their market value." "The responsibility of property," Bennett replied with exaggerated patience, "falls to its legal owners, not to those who can no longer afford to maintain it. The market determines the highest and best use of resources, Mr. Miller. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Perhaps it's time you accepted that reality. As security personnel moved to escort him, Frank paused and looked back at the room of investors. That northern section contains underground communications bunkers that were vital to coordinating Pacific theater operations during World War II. Some things deserve preservation, regardless of profit potential. Bennett returned to his podium with a tight smile. My apologies for the interruption, ladies and gentlemen. Some people struggle to accept that land, like anything else of value, ultimately belongs to those with the vision and resources to maximize its potential. Now, shall we continue with the bidding? We were at 6 million. Outside in the parking lot, Frank stood beside his aging pickup truck, the faded paint contrasting with the luxury vehicles filling most spaces. His face remained composed despite the humiliation he had just endured. He gently placed his leather portfolio on the passenger seat and pulled out his phone. "Will, it's Dad," he said after a moment. "I tried to inform them about the military bunkers at Oak Ridge Farm, but they wouldn't listen. Bennett had me removed from the auction." He listened briefly. No, I'm fine. Just concerned about those historical artifacts. Once they're destroyed, that piece of history is gone forever." After another pause, "You don't need to do that, son. You have more important matters to attend to at the base." Awesome. As Frank ended the call, he noticed Gregory Bennett watching from the auction house window, a satisfied smirk on his face as he observed the old farmer climbing into his truck. In Bennett's mind, he had eliminated a potential complication to his perfectly orchestrated land sale and sent a clear message to other locals who might consider interfering with his business. He had no idea that his confident certainty was about to be shattered. The auction resumed its steady rhythm after Frank Miller's departure. Gregory Bennett quickly re-established control of the room, his confidence seemingly unshaken by the brief disruption. Representatives continued their bidding on the fertile Oak Ridge Farm, with prices climbing toward $5, $2 million. The Eastern parcel includes the original homestead and surrounding 75 acres, Bennett announced, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of a man who knew he was about to make a substantial commission. This section features the historic barn and original farmhouse, which could be converted to an exceptional clubhouse or community center for the development. We're currently at $5, $2 million from Heartland Development Group. Do I hear $5? $4 million. In the parking lot, Frank Miller sat in his truck, his weathered hands still resting on the steering wheel. He hadn't started the engine yet. Instead, he was looking at an old photograph tucked into the visor, a picture of himself as a young man standing with his father beside one of the concealed bunker entrances at Oak Ridge Farm. The Miller family had never owned that particular property, but Frank's father had been part of the civilian construction crew that built the underground facilities in 1942, sworn to secrecy about their true purpose. Frank wasn't fighting for personal gain. That had never been his motivation through 22 years on the Historical Preservation Board or his decades of community service. He was fighting to preserve the rich tapestry of history that defined Westridge County, not just its agricultural heritage, but its little-known role in the Pacific theater operations during World War II. The underground communication bunkers at Oak Ridge Farm represented one of the most significant historical military sites in the state, a place where critical messages had been relayed that helped coordinate Allied victories. His reflections were interrupted by the distant sound of vehicles approaching. Frank glanced in his rearview mirror and was startled to see 3 black military Humvees with government plates turning into the auction house parking lot. Two police cruisers from the county sheriff's department led the small convoy, their lights flashing as they escorted the military vehicles. "Oh, Will," Frank murmured, recognizing the official vehicles, "you really didn't need to come all this way." Inside the auction house, Bennett was in his element, having just secured a $4 million bid on the property. "Excellent. That's $4 million from Eastern Horizons Investment Group. Do I hear $6 million? Remember, ladies and gentlemen, this is a rare opportunity to acquire land with this combination of development potential and location." And the representative from Westland Builders raised his paddle. $6 million. I have $6 million. Do I hear $8 million? Bennett's patter was interrupted by the sound of vehicles pulling up outside. The auction house's large windows offered a clear view of the parking lot, where attendees could now see the procession of official vehicles coming to a stop. "As I was saying," Bennett continued, attempting to recapture the room's attention, "we have $6 million. Do I hear $8 million for this exceptional property?" But the bidders were distracted now, murmuring amongst themselves as they watched the scene unfolding in the parking lot. The center Humvee's door opened, and a distinguished man in his late 40s emerged, wearing a formal military uniform with colonel's insignia. "Is that Colonel Miller?" someone whispered loudly enough to be heard throughout the room. Bennett's confident demeanor faltered momentarily. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, we have important business to conduct. I'm sure whatever official business is taking place outside can proceed without our attention. Now, do I hear $8 million for Oak Ridge Farm?" The auction house doors swung open, and two uniformed military police officers entered, scanning the room before nodding to someone outside. Behind them came a man whose bearing immediately commanded attention, Colonel William Miller, known not only as the commander of the regional military base, but also as a leading expert in military historical preservation. Despite his Washington credentials, he retained the straightforward demeanor of his rural upbringing, authoritative but unpretentious. Flanking him were his aide-de-camp and Dr. Sarah Johnson, chair of the Department of Defense Historical Preservation Division, both carrying portfolios of documents. Frank Miller entered last, looking somewhat embarrassed by the dramatic entrance, but resolute nonetheless. Bennett's face went through a rapid sequence of expressions: surprise, confusion, alarm, and finally an attempt at professional courtesy. "Colonel Miller, this is an unexpected honor. We're in the middle of an auction, but of course, you're welcome to observe. Perhaps your staff would like to place a bid on behalf of the government." Colonel Miller ignored Bennett entirely, instead turning to address the room at large. "Good morning, everyone. I apologize for interrupting your proceedings, but an urgent matter regarding this property has come to my attention." His voice carried natural authority without raising its volume. "I've been informed that this auction may be proceeding without full disclosure of pending federal historical designations that would significantly impact development plans for this property." Bennett moved quickly from behind his podium. "Colonel, I assure you that all legal requirements have been meticulously followed. Our legal team has thoroughly vetted this property. Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding about speculative future designations." "There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Bennett," the colonel replied coolly. "I've just spoken with the director of the Department of Defense Historical Preservation Division. They confirmed that Oak Ridge Farm contains one of the most significant World War II communication outposts discovered in our state in the past 50 years. The preliminary approval for historical designation was signed last week." Dr. Johnson stepped forward, opening her portfolio. "We have certified copies of the preliminary designation right here. The historical assessment confirmed extensive underground facilities dating back to 1942, with intact equipment and documents that provided critical communication support for Pacific Theater operations. She displayed satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar results, showing the outlines of bunker structures beneath the soil in the northern section of the property. This designation will prohibit any ground-disturbing activity on approximately 110 acres of the property. Furthermore, a protected security zone will limit development on an additional 50 acres. A wave of murmurs swept through the audience as the corporate bidders quickly calculated how these restrictions would impact their development plans and potential returns on investment. "Colonel Miller," Bennett said, struggling to maintain his composure. "With all due respect, pending designations are precisely that, pending. They represent potential future restrictions, not current legal encumbrances that require disclosure." "Actually, Mr. Bennett," the colonel countered, "federal law requires disclosure of pending military historical designations that have received preliminary approval, particularly when they involve classified infrastructure. This requirement was added to the National Historic Preservation Act amendments 4 years ago, legislation that I testified in support of before Congress." The room had gone completely silent now, all eyes moving between Bennett and the colonel. "I don't appreciate these insinuations, Colonel," Bennett said, his professional facade beginning to crack. "These properties have been properly vetted according to standard industry practices." "Standard industry practices don't supersede federal law, Mr. Bennett," Dr. Johnson interjected, "and federal law requires full disclosure of pending military historical designations before sale." Colonel Miller turned to address the bidders directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, in the interest of transparency and to prevent any of you from making investments based on incomplete information, I'm requesting a temporary halt to these proceedings pending full disclosure of the property's legal status and encumbrances." He nodded to his staff, who moved to distribute information packets to the potential buyers. "These materials outline the specific areas affected by the designation and the types of activities that would be restricted. Any development plans would need to accommodate these protections." Bennett looked around desperately, seeking support from the crowd, but the corporate representatives were already reviewing the materials, clearly reassessing the property's value given the new information. "This is unprecedented interference in a private business transaction," he protested. "On the contrary," Colonel Miller replied calmly, "this is ensuring that business transactions proceed with full transparency and compliance with federal law. My father attempted to provide this information through appropriate channels, and you had him removed from the premises." All eyes turned to Frank Miller, who stood quietly at the back of the room, still holding his portfolio of documents. "Your father," Bennett stammered, the color draining from his face as he finally made the connection. "Yes, Mr. Bennett. Frank Miller, the washed-up farmer you so dismissively ejected, is my father. He served on the Historical Preservation Board for over 2 decades and has dedicated his life to preserving our region's heritage." The colonel's voice remained measured, but there was steel beneath his calm exterior. More importantly, he was trying to ensure that all parties to this sale had accurate information about the property, information that would significantly affect its value and potential uses, something you actively prevented. Bennett looked desperately toward his legal counsel, Thomas Reynolds, who had sunk low in his chair, already recognizing the severity of the situation. "Colonel Miller," Bennett began, attempting to recover, "had I known Mr. Miller was your father—" "Had you known," the colonel interrupted sharply, "would you have treated him with the respect every citizen deserves? Would you have dismissed his concerns because of his clothes or his age? Or would you have listened only because of his connection to me?" Bennett had no answer. "I believe this auction needs to be rescheduled," Colonel Miller continued, his voice firm but measured. "Not cancelled, rescheduled with full disclosure of the historical designation and its implications for development. Buyers deserve complete information before making multi-million-dollar investments, and sellers deserve fair market value from buyers who understand exactly what they're purchasing. The potential buyers were already huddled in small groups, consulting with colleagues via phone and reassessing their interest given the new information. Several representatives appeared to be packing their materials, preparing to leave. Bennett made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Colonel, perhaps we could take a brief recess to incorporate this information, then resume the auction today. Many of these investors have traveled considerable distances." "Mr. Bennett," the colonel replied, "the proper course of action is to postpone the auction. Update all marketing materials with accurate information about the property's status and allow potential buyers time to adjust their valuations accordingly. Anything less would be a disservice to both buyers and sellers." He turned to address the assembled investors. "I apologize for any inconvenience this causes. My office will be happy to provide detailed information about the historical designation process and its implications for development planning. When this auction is properly rescheduled, you'll be able to bid with confidence, knowing exactly what you're purchasing." As the corporate representatives began filing out, many nodding respectfully to the colonel while casting accusatory glances. At Bennett, the auctioneer stood frozen behind his podium, watching his carefully orchestrated event and substantial commission evaporate. Frank approached his son, his weathered face showing a mixture of pride and embarrassment. "Will, I didn't call you to shut down the auction. I just wanted someone to verify the historical designation status." The colonel smiled at his father, briefly dropping his official demeanor. "I know, Dad, but when you told me they'd thrown you out for trying to share vital information about the property, it confirmed concerns we've been hearing about auction practices across the state. The Historical Resources Protection Amendments we helped establish 4 years ago were designed specifically to prevent situations like this." He lowered his voice. "We've had reports from 3 counties about Bennett's failure to disclose historical and environmental restrictions on properties he's auctioned. The buyers later find themselves unable to implement their development plans and end up in costly litigation." Frank glanced over at Bennett, who was now engaged in an intense conversation with his legal counsel. "He's built quite a business transforming our farming communities piece by piece. That business model is about to change," the colonel replied. Dr. Johnson had joined several investors who appeared particularly interested in the historical findings, explaining the significance of the discovery with genuine enthusiasm. "The communications equipment recovered from these bunkers represents one of the most complete collections from the Pacific War effort. We've found original encryption devices that were thought to be destroyed after the war, along with code books and operational logs." One investor, a woman representing a regional development firm, seemed especially engaged. "Could this have tourism potential? My company has worked with historical sites before, integrating preservation with thoughtful development." "Absolutely," Dr. Johnson replied. "Similar sites have become significant educational attractions when properly preserved and interpreted." Across the room, Bennett looked up and caught Frank's eye, the auctioneer's expression having transformed from smugness to something approaching fear as he watched federal officials answering questions from potential buyers who now understood they had nearly purchased property with significant undisclosed restrictions. In the span of 20 minutes, his carefully constructed reputation for delivering clean properties to developers had begun to crumble. Frank felt no triumph, only quiet satisfaction that the historical communications outpost that had played its small but vital role in World War II might now receive the preservation it deserved. Outside, the autumn sun illuminated the rolling hills surrounding Westridge County, the farmland at the center of the controversy stretching toward the horizon. Land that had been tended by generations of farmers who understood that ownership was temporary, but stewardship was eternal. The colonel's convoy remained parked outside the auction house, a visible reminder that even in changing times, some principles remained worth defending. 4 days later, Frank Miller sat at his kitchen table reviewing seed catalogs for his small organic vegetable operation. Though he had been forced to sell most of his family farm 5 years earlier due to mounting medical bills from Margaret's illness, he had retained 12 acres where he grew heirloom vegetables for local restaurants and the farmers' market. The rich soil of Hillside Haven, as he called his remaining land, produced exceptional crops that commanded premium prices from chefs who appreciated the quality and heritage varieties. The distinctive sound of tires on gravel drew his attention. Through the window, he saw a gleaming black luxury sedan pulling up beside his weathered pickup truck. A moment later, Gregory Bennett emerged, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the rural setting. Frank opened the door before Bennett could knock. "Mr. Bennett?" he said with a nod, his tone neither hostile nor particularly welcoming. "Mr. Miller." The auctioneer shifted his weight awkwardly. "I was hoping we might speak privately." Frank gestured toward the kitchen table. "Coffee? That would be... Yes, thank you." Bennett seemed surprised by the civil reception as Frank poured 2 mugs of coffee from the pot he'd brewed an hour earlier. The auctioneer took in the modest kitchen with its worn but spotless countertops and the wall covered with family photographs. Spanning generations, Frank as a young man in his army uniform, Frank and Margaret on their wedding day, their son Will in his military academy graduation uniform, and more recent photos of Frank with his grandchildren. "I suppose you've come about the Oak Ridge auction," Frank said, placing a mug in front of Bennett and taking the seat across from him. "Yes." Bennett wrapped his hands around the mug but didn't drink. "The Department of Defense has issued formal notification of the preliminary designation. We've rescheduled the auction for next month with full disclosure of the restrictions." Frank nodded but said nothing, allowing the uncomfortable silence to stretch between them. "Mr. Miller," Bennett finally continued, "I owe you an apology for how you were treated at the auction. It was unprofessional and disrespectful." "Is that an apology to me specifically?" Frank asked quietly. "Or to any farmer who might have interrupted your auction with inconvenient information?" Bennett flinched slightly at the directness of the question. "Both, I suppose. The colonel's intervention has prompted some reflection." "My son tends to have that effect on people," Frank replied with the hint of a smile, "though I suspect the potential legal consequences might have contributed to your reflective mood as well. The Federal Historic Preservation Office has opened an inquiry into my disclosure practices," Bennett admitted, staring into his coffee. "Your son's office provided them with documentation of several properties where historical or environmental restrictions weren't properly disclosed." Frank took a slow sip of his coffee, studying the man across from him. In his auction house domain, Bennett projected confident authority. Here, in a farmer's kitchen surrounded by the evidence of a life spent in connection to the land, he seemed diminished somehow. "You know," Frank said finally, "I've lived in Westridge County my entire life, except for my military service. I've watched it change, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. Change itself isn't the enemy. It's how we manage that change that matters." Bennett looked up, seeming surprised by the philosophical turn. "I didn't come to your auction to stop the sale," Frank continued. "The Oakley family decided to sell, and that's their right. I came because buyers deserve to know what they're purchasing, including its limitations and its treasures. The historical designation will significantly reduce the development potential," Bennett observed. the property value will likely decrease by 25% or more. Perhaps in conventional terms, Frank countered, but have you considered there might be buyers who value that history, who might see potential in preserving it while developing the remainder of the property in compatible ways? Bennett's expression suggested this was an entirely new concept to him. What kind of buyer would pay premium prices for land they can't fully develop? The kind who understands that some values can't be measured purely in dollars, Frank replied. The kind who sees opportunity in working with the land's history rather than erasing it. He rose and retrieved a folder from a nearby desk, setting it before Bennett. This contains everything I know about the Oak Ridge communications bunkers, including which areas are most significant and which have less historical importance. It also includes information about similar sites that have been successfully integrated into development projects. Bennett opened the folder, scanning the meticulously organized materials with surprise. "You prepared this for me?" "I prepared it for whoever might purchase Oak Ridge," Frank corrected. "Knowledge shouldn't be hoarded, Mr. Bennett. It should be shared with those who need it to make better decisions." For several minutes, Bennett reviewed the materials in silence. Frank noticed how the auctioneer's expression gradually shifted from skepticism to thoughtful consideration. "This actually changes the narrative," Bennett said finally. "Instead of positioning the restrictions as limitations, we could market the historical site as a unique feature, something that distinguishes this property from every other development opportunity in the region." "Now, you're thinking like someone who values what makes a place unique," Frank observed, "rather than someone trying to make every piece of land interchangeable with every other." Bennett closed the folder, his brow furrowed in thought. "Mr. Miller, would you consider consulting on the marketing of this property? Your knowledge could help us find the right buyer, one who appreciates both its development potential and its historical significance." The request was so unexpected that Frank nearly laughed. "You want the washed-up farmer with outdated ideas to help you sell land?" Bennett had the grace to look embarrassed. Those words were regrettable and, as it turns out, profoundly short-sighted. "You understand this land in ways I never considered." Frank studied the auctioneer for a long moment, weighing his sincerity. "I'll consider it, Mr. Bennett, not to help you specifically, but because I care about what happens to Oak Ridge. Someone should advocate for the land itself in this transaction." As Bennett prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Your son. He's built quite a reputation in the military. People listen when he speaks." "Will learned early that how you treat people matters more than your title or bank account," Frank replied. "He remembers what it means to be from West Ridge County even when he's walking the halls of the Pentagon." "He's fortunate to have had such a teacher," Bennett said, surprising them both with the sincerity in his voice. After Bennett's departure, Frank walked out to his small vegetable fields, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across rows of heirloom tomatoes and peppers. He considered the unexpected turn of events, from being humiliated and ejected from an auction to being asked to consult on the property's sale. The irony wasn't lost on him. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The screen showed his son's name. "The Historical Preservation Office just called," Colonel Miller said after they exchanged greetings. "Bennett has requested a detailed assessment of the underground facilities to help market the property appropriately. Did something happen I should know about?" Frank smiled. "Let's just say Mr. Bennett might be developing an appreciation for historical value that goes beyond building age and architectural significance." "That's unexpected," his son replied, the surprise evident in his voice. "Think it's genuine." "Time will tell," Frank said, looking out across his small farm to the hills beyond, where generations of families, indigenous and settler alike, had tended the land in their own ways. But sometimes, Will, people can surprise you when you give them a chance to reconsider their perspective. The rescheduled auction for Oak Ridge Farm took place 6 weeks later on a crisp December morning. The atmosphere in Summit Auction House bore little resemblance to the previous event. Enlarged aerial photographs of the property lined the walls, with the historical site clearly marked. Beside each image stood informational displays explaining the military significance of the underground communications outpost and its place in the region's wartime history. Gregory Bennett, still impeccably dressed but somehow less imposing than before, moved through the gathering crowd with Frank Miller at his side. Together, they answered questions from potential buyers about both the property's development potential and its historical significance. The northern section contains the most extensive underground facilities, Frank explained to a group of interested investors, indicating areas on a detailed map. But that doesn't mean it can't be an asset to the right development. The Department of Defense has expressed interest in a public-private partnership for preservation, and similar sites in other states have become significant heritage tourism destinations. The preliminary development concepts we've included, Bennett added, demonstrate how the historical preserve could become the centerpiece of a unique residential community, one that celebrates the land's history rather than erasing it. The attendees at this auction differed noticeably from the previous one. While some corporate representatives had returned, they were joined by heritage tourism developers, conservation investors, and even representatives from several historical preservation societies and military heritage organizations. As the auction began, Bennett took his position at the podium with a different energy than before. His typical aggressive sales approach had been replaced by something more thoughtful. "Welcome to this special auction for the historic Oak Ridge Farm," he began. "As you're all aware, this 450-acre property includes a recently discovered World War II communications outpost of significant importance, a discovery that enriches our understanding of this region's contribution to the war effort." He gestured toward Frank, who sat near the front. "We are fortunate to have Mr. Frank Miller with us today, whose knowledge of local history and dedication to preservation helped bring this site to proper attention. Before we begin the bidding, Mr. Miller will provide some context about what makes this property truly exceptional." Frank hadn't expected this public acknowledgement. He rose slowly, making his way to the podium as a respectful hush fell over the room. "Oak Ridge has been many things over the centuries," he began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone deeply connected to the land. "For hundreds of years, it was home to indigenous peoples who built communities along its streams. Later, it became farmland tended by generations of the Oakley family, who worked this soil for nearly 2 centuries. He looked out at the diverse group of potential buyers. "What many don't know is that during World War II, my father was part of a civilian construction crew sworn to secrecy as they built a network of underground communications bunkers on this property. From these facilities, critical messages were relayed that helped coordinate Pacific theater operations." Frank's voice grew more passionate as he continued. "What happens next is up to whoever purchases this land today, but I hope you'll remember that you're not just buying acreage and buildings, you're becoming part of this land's ongoing story. The decisions you make will write the next chapter in a narrative that began long before any of us were here, and will continue long after we're gone." As Frank returned to his seat, Colonel Miller, who had arrived without fanfare and taken a seat in the back row, caught his father's eye and nodded with unmistakable pride. The bidding proceeded with a different rhythm than the typical Bennett auction. Rather than rapid-fire increments focused solely on price, Bennett took time to highlight different aspects of the property as the bidding advanced. emphasizing both development potential and historical significance. When the final gavel fell, Oak Ridge Farm had sold for $4, $2 million, significantly less than the $5, $6 million bid at the previous auction, but substantially more than many had predicted given the development restrictions. The buyer, a consortium led by a sustainable development firm with experience in heritage properties, immediately announced plans for a mixed-use project that would include a historical preserve, educational center, and residential community designed to complement the land's historical character. As the attendees dispersed, Bennett approached Frank and the Colonel, who had joined his father near the displays. "A successful outcome, I think," Bennett said, extending his hand to Frank. "Thank you for your guidance throughout this process. It's been educational." Frank accepted the handshake. "The land found the right steward. That's what matters, Mr. Bennett." "I understand," Colonel Miller said, "that you voluntarily submitted all your upcoming auctions for review by the Federal Historic Preservation Office to ensure proper disclosure of any historical or environmental designations." "Yes, Colonel," Bennett confirmed, straightening his shoulders slightly, "and we're implementing new protocols for all properties going forward. Every auction will include comprehensive information about potential restrictions or special designations, even those still in the application process." "That's commendable," the Colonel acknowledged. "Preventive compliance is always preferable to regulatory enforcement." "Your father helped me understand something important," Bennett said, glancing at Frank, "that the highest value of land isn't always measured by its development potential. Sometimes its history and character are what make it truly valuable, if we're willing to see it." As Bennett moved away to finalize paperwork with the buyers, Colonel Miller turned to his father. "You've made quite an impression on him." Frank smiled slightly. "Sometimes people just need to be reminded of what really matters, even auctioneers who think farmers are living in the past." "Speaking of what matters," the Colonel said, checking his watch, "we should head out if we're going to make it to Emma's soccer championship. Lisa will never forgive us if we're late for the kickoff." "I wouldn't miss my granddaughter's big game for anything," Frank replied, gathering his notes, "not even for making history at an auction house." 6 months after the momentous Oak Ridge auction, Westridge County was experiencing what locals had begun calling the preservation renaissance. The auction had sparked conversations about heritage, land use, and community identity that extended far beyond that single property. Though few would have predicted it, Gregory Bennett stood at the center of this transformation. On a warm spring morning, Bennett's luxury sedan pulled up to Frank Miller's modest farmhouse once again. This time, he carried a portfolio of documents and moved with the confidence of someone arriving for an established meeting rather than an uncomfortable apology. Frank greeted him from the porch, where he sat sorting seed packets for his summer planting. "Right on time, Greg. Coffee's fresh." The transition to first-name basis had evolved naturally over months of collaboration. What had begun as an uneasy consultation had developed into something neither man could have anticipated, a partnership that was reshaping land transactions throughout the region. In the kitchen, they settled at the table, now covered with maps and development proposals. Frank poured coffee into mugs as Bennett arranged his materials. "It's so scary to see nothing." "The Thompson Farm auction is scheduled for next month," Bennett began, opening his portfolio. The historical assessment identified that old stone spring house and ice house, not significant enough for a formal designation, but definitely worth preserving as historical features. Frank nodded, examining the survey results. Those structures date back to 1860, some of the best preserved examples of period construction in the county. Could be incorporated into a recreation area or community feature. "Exactly what I was thinking," Bennett replied, pulling out architectural renderings. I've had preliminary concepts drawn up, showing how they could become the centerpiece of a common area. We'll include these in the marketing materials to attract the right kind of buyer. Frank studied the renderings with approval. You've come a long way from selling clean properties with no complications. Bennett smiled ruefully. I've discovered that what I once saw as complications can actually be selling points to the right buyers. The Johnson property auction last month brought 20% above projected value, specifically because of the wetland conservation area we highlighted. This new approach hadn't emerged overnight. After the Oak Ridge auction, Bennett had faced a reckoning that extended beyond that single property. The Federal Historic Preservation Office's investigation into his prior auctions had identified 5 properties where environmental or historical restrictions hadn't been properly disclosed, resulting in significant fines and a temporary suspension of his auctioneer's license. Rather than retreating or becoming defensive, Bennett had used that time to reassess his entire business model. He'd approached Frank with a proposition: help him develop a new framework for agricultural auctions that would comprehensively document a property's historical, environmental, and cultural assets alongside its development potential. I've finalized the format for our new property portfolios, Bennett said, sliding a bound document across the table. Environmental assessment, historical significance, water resources, soil quality, and community context, all presented with equal prominence to development potential. Frank flipped through the comprehensive document, noting the careful attention to details that most auctioneers would have considered irrelevant just months earlier. This is thorough, Greg. Buyers will have a complete picture of what they're bidding on. That's the goal, Bennett replied. No more surprised investors discovering restrictions after purchase. No more lost heritage sites bulldozed because no one knew their significance. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a truck bearing the logo of Oak Ridge Heritage Farm, the new development taking shape on the property that had catalyzed their unlikely partnership. The driver, a young woman in her early 30s, waved to Frank as she pulled up. That'll be Rebecca with the seedlings for the demonstration garden, Frank explained, rising from the table. Rebecca Torres, the sustainability director for the Oak Ridge development, carried a flat of heirloom vegetable starts as she approached the porch. Morning, Mr. Miller. We've got the Cherokee purple tomatoes and moon and stars watermelons you recommended. The school children are excited about planting them next week. Perfect timing, Frank replied. We were just discussing the educational components. For future developments, Rebecca nodded to Bennett. Your auction house has been generating quite a buzz in sustainable development circles, Mr. Bennett. Your approach to heritage marketing is being discussed as a model in my graduate seminar on conservation development. Bennett seemed momentarily taken aback by this information. I wasn't aware our work had attracted academic attention. Are you kidding? Rebecca laughed. The integration of military preservation with contemporary development at Oak Ridge is becoming a case study. Professor Harmon mentioned you might be willing to speak to our class sometime. After Rebecca departed with plans finalized for the school garden project, Bennett sat quietly, processing this unexpected information. Something wrong? Frank asked. 6 months ago, I was known for delivering clean properties to developers who wanted to erase everything that came before, Bennett replied. Now I'm being discussed in university classes for preservation-oriented marketing. Frank smiled. Life takes interesting turns sometimes. Speaking of which, Bennett said, there's something I've been meaning to discuss with you. He retrieved a folder from his briefcase and placed it before Frank. Inside were photographs and documents related to a small farm on the outskirts of town. The Davis property, Frank recognized immediately. They're planning to sell next year when Mrs. Davis moves to assisted living. Bennett confirmed, "but there's something about that property I discovered during the preliminary assessment that I thought you should know." He turned to a series of ground-penetrating radar images. The survey team found what appears to be a hidden cellar beneath the summer kitchen. It doesn't match any of the building plans. Frank studied the images with growing interest. The Davis farm was part of the Underground Railroad before the Civil War. That hidden cellar was where escaped slaves were sheltered on their journey north. Bennett's eyes widened. "That's not in any of the county historical records." "Because it was secret by necessity," Frank explained. "The knowledge was passed down through generations of the Davis family. Mrs. Davis showed me the chamber years ago, but swore me to secrecy until she was ready to sell. She's given permission now to document this history before the property changes hands." Bennett immediately grasped the significance. "This changes everything about how we'd position that property, instead of marketing it as a simple farmstead. With development potential, we'd be offering a piece of profound historical significance." "Exactly," Frank agreed. "But it needs proper documentation and preservation planning before auction. The wrong buyer could destroy this piece of history without ever knowing it existed." Bennett was already thinking ahead. "We should bring in historical architects to document the chamber, maybe apply for historical designation to protect it specifically without restricting the entire property." "My thoughts exactly," Frank said, "and Mrs. Davis would rest easier knowing this part of her family's legacy will be preserved." "You know," Bennett said thoughtfully, 6 months ago, I would have seen this as a complication to be minimized or hidden. Now I see it as the property's most valuable feature, something that makes it unique and irreplaceable." Frank nodded. "That's the most important shift in your thinking, Greg. Land isn't just square footage and zoning potential. It carries stories, some buried in the soil and some passed down through generations. Those stories have value too, not just cultural or historical value, but increasingly market value as well." Later that afternoon, Bennett found himself in an unexpected location, the grand opening of the Oak Ridge Military History Center. The state-of-the-art facility, situated at the edge of the preserved communications bunker site, represented the developer's commitment to honoring the land's history while creating a contemporary community around it. The center's modern architecture intentionally echoed elements discovered in the underground facilities, a subtle bridging of past and present that created a unique sense of place. Inside, interactive displays told the story of the military communications specialists who had worked there during World War II, their contributions to the Pacific Theater operations, and the technological innovations they had pioneered. Colonel Miller was scheduled to speak at the dedication ceremony, and Frank had insisted Bennett attend. "You helped make this possible," Frank had told him. "You should see what your change of approach accomplished." Now, as Bennett moved through the crowd of local residents, military veterans, historians, and new homeowners from the development, he felt strangely out of place, yet somehow involved in a way he'd never experienced in his career. People who recognized him often stopped to shake his hand, thanking him for his role in preserving the site, rather than allowing it to be destroyed for conventional development. "Mr. Bennett," called a voice, and he turned to find himself face to face with Colonel Miller. "Colonel," he acknowledged with a nod, still somewhat uncomfortable in the military officer's presence given their first contentious meeting. "I'm glad you could join us today," the colonel said, surprising Bennett with his warmth. "My father speaks highly of the work you've been doing these past months." Bennett glanced across the room where Frank was engaged in animated conversation with several military historians, discussing communication techniques that had once been employed in the very bunkers beneath their feet. "Your father has been instrumental in my education, Colonel," Bennett replied carefully. "He's helped me see value where I previously saw only obstacles." That's one of his gifts, the colonel agreed, helping people recognize the worth of things they've overlooked. I'd like to discuss something with you if you have a moment. He led Bennett to a quieter corner of the exhibit hall. I'm working on legislation to create incentives for heritage-sensitive development, tax benefits, expedited permitting, and grant opportunities for projects that incorporate historical and cultural preservation in meaningful ways. Bennett listened with growing interest as the colonel outlined a vision for development that honored a community's past while creating its future. The auction materials you've developed with my father for marketing heritage properties could serve as a model for the documentation standards in this legislation, the colonel continued. Would you be willing to consult with my staff on practical implementation from an industry perspective? 6 months earlier, Bennett would have viewed government involvement in his business practices as unwelcome interference. Now he recognized an opportunity to help shape standards that aligned with his evolving approach. I'd be honored, Colonel, he replied, if what we're learning through trial and error could help create a framework that benefits communities, developers, and property values simultaneously. I'm all for it. Indeed, the formal dedication ceremony began with a blessing from a local veteran who had served in the Pacific Theater, acknowledging the contributions of the communications specialists who had worked in these underground facilities. The developer spoke about the journey from initial concept to the integrated community now taking shape, homes and businesses designed to complement the landscape rather than dominate it, with the historical site serving as its cultural and educational heart. When Colonel Miller took the podium, he spoke about the deeper meaning of preservation. What we protect tells future generations what we value, he said, his voice carrying across the attentive crowd. By preserving this site, we declare that the story of this land didn't begin with residential development, that we value the knowledge, sacrifice, and history of all who have called this place home. He acknowledged the developer's vision, the military historian's guidance, and the local historical commission's persistence. Then, to Bennett's surprise, the colonel continued, I also want to recognize the evolution in our approach to land, transactions that made this possible. Gregory Bennett's auction house has pioneered a new model for agricultural land sales, one that treats historical and cultural features as assets rather than liabilities. Bennett felt countless eyes turned toward him as the colonel added, his willingness to transform his business practices demonstrates that economic prosperity and cultural preservation aren't opposing forces. They're complementary values that strengthen each other when properly aligned. The acknowledgement from a man who had once confronted him in front of clients left Bennett momentarily speechless. As applause rippled through the crowd, he caught Frank's eye across the room. The old farmer gave him a slight nod that somehow conveyed both approval and the understanding that this transformation remained a work in progress. After the ceremony, attendees toured the preserved underground facilities, where carefully designed pathways allowed visitors to view the communications, equipment and historical displays without disturbing sensitive areas. Military historians explained their ongoing work, pointing out features that revealed how the outpost had operated during the war, transmitting critical information that helped coordinate Allied victories in the Pacific. Bennett found himself walking alongside Frank, both men silent as they absorbed the significance of what had been preserved. You know, Bennett finally said, when I was having you escorted out of my auction house, I never imagined I'd be standing here 6 months, later being acknowledged by a high-ranking military officer for preservation work. Frank chuckled. Life rarely follows the path we expect. Sometimes it takes an unexpected detour to show us where we should have been heading all along. They paused at an overlook that provided a sweeping view of both the historical site and the new development taking shape around it. The architectural harmony between them was striking. Modern homes designed with subtle references to the area's agricultural heritage, oriented to respect the natural contours of the land. "I was wrong, you know," Bennett admitted quietly, "when I said that land belongs to those who can write the biggest check. The truth is more complicated than that." "How do you see it now?" Frank asked. Bennett considered the question carefully. "Land has memory, longer than any deed or title. We might hold legal ownership for a time, but we're still answerable to something deeper, the patterns and principles embedded in the land itself. Ignoring those patterns eventually creates problems no legal document can resolve." Frank nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. Not bad for an auctioneer who once specialized in clean properties with no complications. Dewey. The following month brought the first test of their new approach with a high-profile auction of the Reynolds Farm, a 320-acre property with both agricultural value and development potential. Unlike previous auctions, Bennett had marketed this one specifically to conservation-minded investors, highlighting not just its development capacity, but its historical features, wildlife habitat, and potential for sustainable agriculture. The auction catalogue, developed with Frank's guidance, contained comprehensive documentation of the property's natural and cultural resources alongside traditional information about zoning and infrastructure. Each potential restriction was presented, not as a limitation, but as an opportunity for distinctive, place-appropriate development. The morning of the auction, Bennett found himself unusually nervous as he prepared the auction house for the event. The traditional rows of seating had been rearranged to accommodate display stations around the perimeter of the room, each highlighting different aspects of the property, from soil quality maps to historical documentation of the 19th century homestead. "Having second thoughts?" Frank asked, arriving early to help with final preparations. "Not about the approach," Bennett replied, adjusting displays, "but this is the first major auction since we implemented the new format. What if buyers aren't interested in this level of detail? What if they just want maximum development potential with minimum restrictions? Then they're not the right buyers for this property," Frank said simply. "Better to attract fewer bidders who understand the land's true value than a room full of people who'll destroy what makes it special." As the auction time approached, Bennett watched with growing relief as the room filled with a diverse group of potential buyers. Traditional developers were present, but so were conservation investors, sustainable agriculture representatives, and even a community land trust looking to preserve working farmland. When Bennett took the podium, he surveyed the assembled bidders with a sense of purpose that felt different from his previous focus on driving up prices at any cost. "Welcome to what I believe is a new chapter in agricultural land auctions," he began. "Today's property offers not just acreage and development potential, but a unique combination of historical features, natural resources, and agricultural heritage. Our goal is to find the right steward for this land, someone who values all these dimensions and will build upon them rather than erasing them." The auction proceeded with a different rhythm than his previous sales. Instead of rapid-fire bidding focused solely on price, Bennett took time between bids to highlight different aspects of the property, from its water resources to the historical significance of its original homestead. When the final bid was accepted, the property sold for 10% above its pre-auction valuation. Not the dramatic markup Bennett had sometimes achieved in the past by downplaying restrictions, but a fair price that reflected the property's true character and potential. The buyer, a sustainable development firm specializing in agricultural communities, approached Bennett and Frank after the auction concluded. "Your property portfolio made all the difference," the developer said. shaking both their hands. The comprehensive documentation helped us envision a project that works with the land's character rather than imposing our standard model. We actually value the historical elements you highlighted. They'll give our development a sense of place that can't be manufactured. As the auction house emptied, Bennett found himself standing with Frank amid the displays they had created. Together, the physical embodiment of their new approach to land transactions. A success, I'd say, Frank observed. Yes, Bennett agreed, though not in the way I would have defined success a year ago. We didn't achieve the highest possible price regardless of consequences. We found the right buyer at a fair price that reflects the land's true value. And that's the difference, Frank said. You're no longer just selling land. You're matching properties with people who will be good stewards of them. Bennett considered this characterization. I'm still an auctioneer, Frank. I still work for the sellers and aim to get them fair market value. But I've realized that fair market value includes recognizing what makes each property unique and finding buyers who value those qualities. Frank smiled. That's all I ever hoped you'd understand. Land isn't just a commodity, it's a relationship between people and place, past and future, natural systems and human needs. When we honor that relationship in our transactions, everyone benefits. Buyers, sellers, and the community that will live with the results long after the sale is forgotten. As they gathered their materials, Bennett paused. You know, when your son arrived with his convoy and shut down my auction, I thought my business was ruined. Instead, it was transformed into something more meaningful than I could have imagined. Sometimes, Frank replied, glancing at a photograph of the military communications site now protected at Oak Ridge. The things we initially see as obstacles become the foundation for something better than we had planned. The land teaches that lesson to anyone willing to listen. 5 years later, the National Rural Heritage Conference in Washington, D.C. buzzed with energy as delegates from agricultural communities across the country gathered to exchange ideas about land stewardship, historical preservation, and sustainable development. The grand ballroom of the conference center was filled to capacity for the keynote address, Redefining Value, the Transformation of Rural Land Markets. At the podium stood Gregory Bennett, his appearance subtly changed from the aggressive auctioneer of years past. His suit was still impeccably tailored, but his demeanor carried a thoughtful gravitas that came from years of reimagining his life's work. Behind him, a large screen displayed the now iconic image of the Oak Ridge Military History Center, a modern building seamlessly integrated with the restored entrance to the underground communications bunkers, surrounded by homes and farms designed to honor the land's natural contours. 5 years ago, Bennett began, his voice carrying clearly through the attentive crowd, I stood in my auction house, preparing to sell a historic farm to the highest bidder with no regard for its cultural significance or historical value. My business model was simple: minimize complications, maximize development potential, and drive up the price. He paused, his gaze moving across the diverse audience of farmers, developers, preservationists, and policymakers. That day, an elderly farmer named Frank Miller tried to inform potential buyers about an undisclosed military site on the property, evidence of a World War II communications outpost that had played a crucial role in Pacific theater operations. I had him escorted from the building. Murmurs rippled through the audience as Bennett continued. 20 minutes later, a military officer arrived to halt the auction. That officer happened to be Frank Miller's son, and he came armed with documentation of a pending historical designation that I had failed to disclose to buyers. Bennett's voice softened slightly. What could have ended my career instead began. Its transformation. Over the past 5 years, what started as a humbling lesson in legal compliance has evolved into something I never could have imagined. a completely new approach to valuing and transferring rural land. In the front row, Frank Miller sat beside his son, now a full colonel and recently appointed director of the Military Heritage Preservation Program. At 77, Frank's face showed more lines. His hair had whitened completely, but his eyes remained sharp and engaged as he listened to the man who had once dismissed him as irrelevant. Throughout the day, conference attendees had toured displays showcasing the Miller-Bennett method of comprehensive land assessment, now implemented in rural communities across 23 states. What had begun as a reluctant partnership between an elderly farmer and a chastened auctioneer had evolved into a framework that was transforming how agricultural land was valued and transferred. The fundamental insight that changed everything, Bennett continued, advancing to a slide showing a comprehensive property portfolio, was recognizing that land carries multiple forms of value: agricultural, ecological, historical, and cultural. When we document and market these values, rather than treating them as obstacles to development, we attract buyers who will be better stewards of the land. He clicked to the next slide, showing before and after images of several properties sold through his auction house. Each after image showed development that preserved historical features, protected ecological assets, and maintained agricultural productivity while still creating economic value. The results have exceeded our most optimistic projections, Bennett explained. Properties marketed with comprehensive historical and ecological assessments have sold for an average of 15% more than comparable properties marketed traditionally. More importantly, these sales have resulted in developments that enhance rather than diminish community character and environmental health. As Bennett's presentation continued, he highlighted case studies from across the country where the approach pioneered in Westridge County had been adapted to local conditions. A California vineyard where indigenous agricultural methods had been incorporated into modern wine production. A New England dairy farm where Revolutionary War-era structures had become the centerpiece of an agricultural education center. A Texas ranch where wildlife corridors had been preserved alongside cattle operations. What began as a confrontation in an auction house has evolved into a collaborative model that bridges traditional divides between development and preservation, between profit and stewardship, between economic and cultural values, Bennett concluded. And none of it would have happened without the wisdom and persistence of a farmer who refused to remain silent when he saw heritage at risk of being erased. The applause that followed reflected not just appreciation for the presentation, but recognition of a fundamental shift in thinking about land value, a shift that was gaining momentum in rural communities across the nation. After the keynote, the conference broke into specialized sessions, with Bennett leading a workshop on implementing comprehensive assessment protocols for land transactions. The room was packed with auctioneers, real estate professionals, and rural development officials eager to learn how to apply the approach in their own communities. The key insight, Bennett explained to the attentive group, is that restrictions we once viewed as liabilities can actually become assets when properly documented and marketed to appropriate buyers. A wetland that prevents conventional development might be perfect for a conservation-minded buyer who values wildlife habitat. An archaeological site that requires preservation can become the distinctive feature that makes a development unique in the marketplace. As the workshop progressed, participants shared their own experiences and challenges in rural land transactions. A real estate agent from Oregon described the tension between out-of-state buyers seeking pristine views and local ranchers needing to maintain working landscapes. A county planner from Alabama discussed the pressure to convert agricultural land to suburban development despite community wishes to preserve farming heritage. These tensions aren't new, Bennett acknowledged. What's new is our approach to resolving them. Instead of positioning development and preservation as opposing forces, we're finding ways they can complement each other. He displayed a sample property portfolio showing how a farm in Westridge County had been marketed not just for its development potential, but for its historical features, soil quality, water resources, and cultural significance. By documenting these aspects comprehensively, we attracted buyers who valued the property's unique character rather than seeing it as a blank slate for generic development. The result was a higher sale price for the seller and a better outcome for the community. In another conference room, Colonel Miller led a panel on policy innovations supporting rural heritage preservation. Frank sat in the audience, observing with quiet pride as his son outlined legislation inspired by their experiences in Westridge County. The Rural Heritage Investment Act creates financial incentives for development that preserves agricultural, land, and cultural resources, the colonel explained. Tax credits, expedited permitting, and grant opportunities for projects that integrate preservation with economic development. He acknowledged the challenges of implementation. This isn't about stopping development or keeping rural communities frozen in time. It's about ensuring that change happens in ways that honor what makes each place unique and valuable. The colonel's gaze found his father in the audience. My perspective on these issues was shaped by growing up with a father who taught me that land isn't just a commodity to be bought and sold for maximum profit. It's a trust we hold temporarily, with obligations to both past and future generations. As the day's sessions concluded, attendees gathered for an evening reception in the conference center's atrium, where displays showcased successful heritage-conscious developments from across the country. Among them stood a detailed model of the Oak Ridge community, the development that had grown from the contentious auction 5 years earlier. Frank Miller found himself standing beside Gregory Bennett as they observed a group of young farmers and developers engaged in animated conversation about adaptive reuse of historic agricultural structures. "Look at them," Frank said quietly. 5 years ago, those two groups would have been in opposing camps. Now they're collaborating. Bennett nodded. That's perhaps the most significant change, breaking down the artificial divisions between preservation and progress, between honoring heritage and creating prosperity. Not an easy lesson for some to learn, Frank observed with a slight smile. Certainly wasn't for me, Bennett acknowledged. I still remember the shock of seeing those military vehicles pull into my auction house parking lot. In that moment, I was certain my business was finished. And now you're keynoting national conferences on the approach that emerged from that confrontation, Frank replied. Life takes unexpected turns. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young woman in her early 30s, Rebecca Torres, now director of the Oak Ridge Heritage Center, and an emerging voice in heritage conservation. Mr. Miller, Mr. Bennett, she greeted them warmly. The university research team just finished their 3rd season of excavation at the Oak Ridge bunkers. We've discovered documents that could have significant applications for modern secure communication systems. She explained how the military specialists who had worked at Oak Ridge decades ago had developed innovative techniques for message encryption and transmission, methods that contemporary cybersecurity experts were now studying for potential applications. The knowledge was there all along, Rebecca concluded, preserved in those underground rooms. If the site had been bulldozed for conventional development, these insights would have been lost forever. After she departed, Bennett turned to Frank with a thoughtful expression. She reminds me of something I've been meaning to ask you. When you stood up in my auction that day, did you have any idea what it would lead to? Did you envision all of this? Frank chuckled softly. Not in the slightest. I just knew that military sites shouldn't be destroyed without buyers at least knowing it existed. I was thinking about one piece of land, not a national movement. And yet, here we are. Bennett gestured to the diverse gathering of rural advocates who had assembled to learn from their experience. The following morning, the conference featured a special ceremony recognizing pioneers in rural heritage preservation. Colonel Miller took the podium to present the inaugural Rural Heritage Stewardship Award. This award recognizes individuals who have made extraordinary contributions to preserving the character and cultural resources of rural America while creating paths for sustainable economic development, he explained. I can think of no more deserving recipient than someone who has transformed how we think about the value of rural land. The colonel smiled. Though I admit I'm hardly an impartial judge, given that the recipient is my father, Frank Miller. Applause filled the room as Frank made his way to the podium, his gait slower than 5 years ago, but his presence still commanding respect. The award, a bronze sculpture depicting hands cradling soil from which a seedling emerged, represented the philosophy he had lived by throughout his life. I'm honored by this recognition, Frank began, though I must say it feels somewhat undeserved. I didn't set out to create a movement or change national policy. I simply stood up for something I believed in, that the history embedded in our land deserves respect, and that those who purchase property should know what they're buying, both its possibilities and its responsibilities. He glanced toward Gregory Bennett in the front row. What's remarkable isn't that I spoke up that day in the auction house. What's remarkable is that someone who initially dismissed those concerns was willing to reconsider his perspective and ultimately become the most effective advocate for a new approach to land valuation. Frank held up the award. This recognition belongs not just to me, but to everyone who has worked to bridge the false divide between preservation and development, between honoring the past and creating the future, particularly to Gregory Bennett, whose transformation from adversary to ally demonstrates that change is always possible when we're willing to see value in what we once dismissed. The afternoon of the conference's final day featured a special tour of the National Agricultural Heritage Center, where a new exhibit documented the evolution of the Miller-Bennett method and its impact on rural communities nationwide. The exhibit included interactive displays showing before and after results in communities that had adopted the comprehensive assessment approach. As conference attendees explored the exhibit, Frank found himself approached by a group of young farmers from diverse backgrounds, participants in an agricultural leadership program sponsored by Colonel Miller's office. "Mr. Miller," one young woman said, "your son mentioned you might be willing to share some thoughts about balancing tradition and innovation in farming communities. We're all facing pressure to either abandon traditional practices entirely or reject new approaches that might be beneficial." Frank considered the question thoughtfully. "The wisdom I've gained over my lifetime isn't about choosing between tradition and innovation. It's about understanding that the best innovations often emerge from deep knowledge of tradition." He led them to a display showing the military communications techniques discovered at the Oak Ridge bunkers, technology developed decades ago that was finding new applications in modern security systems. These communication methods, developed through necessity during wartime, are now informing cutting-edge cybersecurity. Modern experts are finding value in what many would have dismissed as outdated technology. The young farmers listened intently as Frank continued. "The key is approaching both tradition and innovation with genuine curiosity rather than rigid ideology. Ask what purpose a traditional practice served and whether that purpose still matters today. Ask what problem a new technology solves and whether that problem exists in your specific context." One young man raised his hand. But how do we preserve agricultural heritage when economic pressures push toward consolidation and development? That's where our work in reforming land transactions becomes essential, Frank replied. By documenting and valuing the multiple dimensions of agricultural land, not just its development potential, we create markets that reward good stewardship. The Oak Ridge model demonstrates that development and preservation can coexist when we're thoughtful about design and placement. As the young farmers continued their questions, Gregory Bennett observed from a distance, struck by the natural authority Frank projected despite his advanced age and modest demeanor. The washed-up farmer he had dismissed years ago was now a respected elder whose wisdom was sought by a new generation of agricultural leaders. Later that evening, at a small dinner gathering of conference organizers and speakers, Colonel Miller raised his glass in a toast. "To unexpected partnerships," he said, nodding toward his father and Bennett, "and to the recognition that our most contentious disagreements sometimes contain the seeds of our most important innovations." As conversations flowed around the table, Frank and Bennett found themselves momentarily apart from the others. "Your son's legislation is gaining impressive bipartisan support," Bennett noted. "The Rural Heritage Investment Act might actually pass in this session." Frank nodded. "Will has always understood that preserving agricultural heritage isn't a partisan issue. It's about maintaining the character and health of rural communities, regardless of political affiliation. Something I've come to appreciate as well," Bennett replied, "though it took a rather dramatic intervention to open my eyes." Frank smiled slightly. "Sometimes we need a jolt to see beyond our established patterns. I'm just grateful you were willing to reconsider your approach, rather than simply moving to another county where you weren't known." "I considered it," Bennett admitted. "For about a week after the auction, I seriously thought about relocating my business, but something you said that day kept coming back to me." "What was that?" "You said the land carries history and responsibility. At the time, I dismissed it as sentimentality, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The more properties I researched, the more I realized how much history was being erased in the transactions I facilitated. Not just military sites, but farming practices, water knowledge, community connections." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I've built my career on the transfer of land, Frank, but you helped me understand that what's really being transferred isn't just legal ownership. It's a relationship with something that existed long before us and will continue long after we're gone." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.